Okay, shalom everyone. Today is January the 8th, 2024. We are discussing Parshat VaEra, second Parsha in the book of Shemot. I hope you all had a good little break. Um, we missed the momentum. I'm sorry about that. We just to recapitulate, we ended the book of Breshit.
Mhm.
That whole generation died, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in Egypt and we're enslaved, and it's just awful. I want to say by way of beginning that you know it takes a moment, it takes a beat or two to get into the mood and to the framework of the book of Exodus. I said last time we were together, and I said in sermons and on the Parsha talk or whatever, whenever the book of Breshit, whenever we come to the end of Breshit, I always feel a kind of sadness. We've gotten to know these stories and these characters and live inside their lives, you know, as disagreeable as most of them are. We love them. They're ours. And I would say, we learn so much just by living inside their lives. Um, and I guess I want to say we love them. We love them. And as the book ends, we kind of feel a passing, their passing, and it also reminds us, I think, of time and of the cycles. And so I always have a certain wistfulness at the end of the book of Breshit, and suddenly, thrust into the world of Egypt, it takes a few moments to adjust our perspective. What is our perspective? Well, in last week's Parsha, we uh, met Moses, and we'll, of course, talk about him more this week. Um, and we encountered the extraordinary suffering of the Israelites under Egyptian oppressive slavery. We see a moment of uh, moral courage in the Egyptian midwives or midwives to the Israelites, whether they're Israelites or Egyptian. That is something that we talked about in previous time. Um, and that the extraordinary ability of the Israelites to persevere under such oppression. And yet it comes with a terrible, terrible cost. Moses, who grew up in the Egyptian Pharaoh's palace, adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, no less, uh, has his own moment of reckoning of his identity. Moses goes out to his brothers, it says, and sees Sivlotam, which can be translated variously as the suffering of his brothers or the suffering of his Egyptian brothers. That is to say, the the level of exasperation that they must endure as overseers. We'll set that aside a second. He has to encounter something in the moment that he sees the Egyptian smiting the Israelite, the Hebrew. His indignation, his moral indignation is aroused. That is to say, the powerful is subduing and beating the powerless. And this moment of moral outrage is where he acts. And Moses defends the uh, injured Hebrew. And we interpret this to mean that this Hebrew is being injured to the point where his life is, in the balance. And Moses smites the Egyptian. Uh, and my interpretation, our interpretation, is that he doesn't really intend to kill the Egyptian. It is an act of manslaughter, and buries him. The next day, Moses sees two Hebrews fighting and tries to intervene. And one says, the Rasha, the mean one, says to him, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? Or he doesn't say yesterday, like you killed the Egyptian. Moses realizes that the item is known, and that's when he fears for his life and he runs away. Um, but I mean, that's the story. And the subtext of the story really is the question, who am I? What am I? What is my identity? Am I Egyptian or am I Hebrew? How would he know that he is one or the other? Well, he knows something about his identity. He knows that he's adopted. He knows that he has an Egyptian mother. He may have had, some contact with his Hebrew parents. I mean, after all, his mother, his Hebrew mother, his real mother, nursed him, we don't know what age he was when he was weaned, but he certainly had, consciousness of identity at that point. There are children who are, nursed well into, I don't know, 2, 3 years of age. There are, this is even popular today. So we know that Moses has some inkling of his identity and is confused about his identity. And when he runs away, how is he running away? And as what is he running away? And I'll just, to highlight this, because we're going to go into these texts a little more deeply in a second. He'll end up in Midian. Um, he will intervene with the daughters of Yitro who are at the well. They're shepherding Yitro's flocks, and they're being roughed up at the well by some men, some shepherds. Moses intervenes with that, and then they leave him there. And Yitro says, "Why did you leave him there?" What do they say to Yitro? We saw an Egyptian man. We saw an Egyptian man. So Moses, clearly in the eyes of the narrator and in the eyes of the Midianite girls, is an Egyptian. So he's left his Hebrew identity behind, and in their mind, he's an Egyptian. And they will invite him back to their house. He will end up marrying Tzipporah, and he'll live there for quite a long time. And basically, the question will remain for us as readers: what does he think of himself in that period of exile? Is he longing to return to Egypt? Is he longing for his people? Does he even think about his people? Does he even care about his people? We'll have to leave those questions for a moment. Um, he ends up going back, or he ends up, sorry, before he goes back, how could I miss this moment? Uh, he he will be tending the sheep of Yitro, and then, of course, as he tends to the sheep in a wilderness near a mountain or at the mountain, God will appear. Sorry, excuse me 1 second. God will appear to him in this mountain in a bush. The bush is consumed by fire, but not being consumed. Moses sees this, and then God speaks to him from there and tells him that he wants to rescue his people and send him back. So Moses get sent back, and Moses, at the end of last week's parsha, will make, will appear before Pharaoh. We've skipped a couple of details, but he appear before Pharaoh. Pharaoh will make the conditions of the Israelites even harsher, and that is where we have Moses. So in the arc that I want to kind of stretch out here is the question of who am I and what am I and how to identify. That is to say, Moses asking himself, who am I? What am I? And how that question ultimately has to resolve itself. I would say, from a leadership perspective, Moses is the perfect, nominee to be leader of Israel within the Egyptian context, because A, he's kind of Hebrew, and B, is kind of Egyptian. He's differentiated from both groups, and that makes him, I think, a perfect uh, uh, nominee, because he is both identified and differentiated from them, and that is important in leadership. I'll stop there, and Susie, you have a comment.
Yeah. So he knows that he's not Egyptian because he doesn't look like an Egyptian.
Well,
And and
you
the
know,
and And Yitro's daughters call him an Egyptian because he talks like one.
Again, these are elements of identity that would be presented, in various ways. I mean, I'm going to only laugh at it and say, well, what does it mean to look like an Egyptian?
He has a beard, and the
you,
Egyptians
you
don't.
you think he has a beard. I mean, so where does it say he has a beard? It doesn't say has it. It doesn't say
Genetically, he
anything.
would have one.
It doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't say anything about what he looks like. It doesn't say anything about what he dresses. We are assuming that he goes out among his brothers. Now, I mean, it's to me, it's a great interpretive question. What does he wear? What does he look like? We know what he speaks. He definitely speaks Egyptian. He can't be speaking Hebrew to them, which is one of the little ironies in the text, because they're all speaking Hebrew, but it's obvious that if he's Egyptian, he's Egyptian. It's obvious that by the time he gets to Midian and the well, they don't identify him anything other than Egyptian. Now, would they have known what a Hebrew looks like? I doubt it. Okay. But that's going to be a question that has to remain unanswered. They don't all they know is they know that he is an Egyptian. They speak Egyptian. He looks like whatever. And I mean, I would just say, by way of kind of parenthetically, there are plenty of Jews that don't look Jewish and are very Jewish, and there are plenty of people who look very Jewish who are not Jewish. You know, uh, I just have to say this as a kind of aside. The singer Alanis Morissette, who comes from Ottawa, was on this PBS the show called Roots, or Finding Your Roots, and discovered that she was in fact Jewish. And I always had a sense that Alanis Morissette was Jewish because she looked Jewish. Anyway, I wrote on her fan page, I said, "Welcome to the people you never left. And from one Ottawa Jew to another, it's good to have you with us." Anyway, Nanette, you had a question.
Did she answer?
No, she didn't answer, but I don't expect her to answer. Anyway, go ahead.
So, so hey, Rabbi. So, I mean, this is an incredible story. I mean, I don't have to say it was such a great story. They made a whole movie out of it. But I think you've always said this, or I think I thought of this, I don't know why, but if God is the director of this whole drama, does any of this really matter? I mean, other than the fact that we can just sit back and see how the whole story evolves.
Well, it always does matter, and because this framework of religious understanding has, holds two truths at the same time. One truth is that God ordains all of history, and the second truth is that human beings have total freedom to choose the destiny. And so I think that's the tension that we're operating with. I think in the whole Bible, and a certain extent, I think religious life is framed around this idea that every single one of us, every single moment of every single day, makes our choices out of a whole set of free circumstances. And yet we also believe that in some dimension of our reality, our lives belong to a larger drama, and that I think it's a particularly religious worldview. I wouldn't necessarily identify it only particularly as a Jewish worldview. It's a worldview shared by many religious ideologies, and we have our particular flavor on that. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, Rabbi, as you're speaking about the idea of identity, are we forced to choose between an either or rather than a both and? And where I'm going with that is, am I an American Jew or a Jewish American? Is someone a Canadian Jew or a Jewish Canadian? And
Yeah,
so, can you be both? And are we talking about it in the day-to-day realm or in the spiritual realm?
it's such a great question, because identity, as you know, is so charged today with multiple layers of identity. And um, at a certain point, for us, it's a great thing that Moses has multiple layers of identity, and we haven't even added masculinity, and we haven't even added, any other dimensions of identity. That's a particularly modern construction of a human life. At a certain point, he's going to have to declare himself. The only analogy that I can come up with that may not be satisfying is that, when you serve, I'll use the Israeli analogy, okay? Americans who make Aliyah and then elect, or are chosen or decide to serve in government or serve in the Knesset, Ron Dermer, Michael Oren, for example, both of them have this moment where or under Israeli law, they have to renounce their they have to renounce their citizenship to another country, because you can only have citizenship in one country, in Israel, to serve Israel. So to renounce American citizenship is actually quite a profound moment. You have to go before an American officer or ambassador or State Department official, and you have to declare that you are not going to be American. You renounce your American, and what they do, and Michael Oren describes this movingly in his memoir, Ally. They take your passport and they take a hole puncher and they punch the passport through the heart of the eagle, okay? As if to say, this is what you're doing. Your act of renunciation of citizenship is a pierce to the ethos of America. And if that's what you want to do, so be it. And so he describes doing this, and they're and I think Ron Dermer had the same experience, and others. They have a certain confraternity. These Americans who end up serving in the Israeli government, who all have to renounce their American citizenship, who all have had this experience of getting their passports pierced. So at some point, what I'm saying is, yeah, you have to declare. You have to make a declaration. Now we live now with multiple identities, and it's much easier to navigate that. And so therefore, modern readers of this or current contemporaries might want to see, quote unquote, the intersectionality of Moses' identity here. And that makes him particularly interesting and differentiated from, I'll use that reading as well. Okay, let's go into it. And so our Parsha begins then with all of that in the background, that there's been a dilemma or conflict already brewing, and Moses has already appeared before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh has made things worse. And not only has Pharaoh made things worse, but the Israelite taskmasters themselves have already appeared before Moses and say, like, excuse me, what the hell are you doing? Why are you making it worse for us? And that's where we'll pick up this week's Parsha. It goes here and says, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am God. I was seen by Avram, by Yitzchak, and by Yaakov as God Shaddai, but by my name, Yahweh, was not known to them. V'gam akimoti et briti, I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their sojourning, where they are sojourned. V'gam ani shamati, I have heard the moaning of Israel, whom Egypt is holding in servitude, and I've called to mind my base, Kor et briti. Therefore, say to the children of Israel, I am God. I will bring you out from beneath the burdens of Egypt. I will rescue you from the servitude. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with great acts. I will take you for me as a people, and I will be for you as a God. And you shall know that I am God, your God, who brings you out from beneath the burdens of Egypt. Ve'eveti etchem, I will bring you to the land over which I lifted my hand in oath to give to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I will give it to you as a possession. I am God. Moshe spoke thus to the children of Israel, but they did not hearken to Moshe out of shortness of spirit and hard servitude. I'm just zipping through that. It's a familiar text to us. It's a familiar text because we have that kind of engraved in our minds from the Passover story. And these four terms here which I'm not going to focus on as the subject of a class. Hotzeti etchem mitachat tzivlot Mitzrayim, v'itzalti etchem me'avodatam, v'laga'alti etchem b'Yisrael tuyah, v'lakachti etchem nila'am, which means I will take you out, I will rescue you, I will redeem you, and I will take you to me as a partner. So that's very Jewish. We've made that the core of the Passover experience. We've made that the core of our understanding, specifically of the day. We call this the 4 terms of redemption. And then it says in here, and that becomes the frame of the Passover Seder for questions, for scenes, for cups, for children, etc. 4 is the kind of organizing framework of the Passover experience. But I'm going to leave all of that aside, okay? We're familiar with this text because of how we've understood this and ritualized it in 4 cups of wine and other things to do with Passover. But in the text itself, there's another dynamic going on. And what's that dynamic? Going back to verse 5, we have, V'gam ani shamati et nakat b'nei Israel. I heard the moaning of the children of Israel. Asher mitzram avidim otam, va'eskor et briti, and I have remembered my covenant. We've heard something like this before at the burning bush, okay? When God first spoke to Moses, he said something like this. But here what I'm doing, and I'm going to ask you to really, really focus. I mean, we're at a certain set of disadvantages because we're not in person. We don't have the books in front of us. We don't have a blackboard or text. I'm going to try to do the best I can by putting these texts up on the screen here. Is that there's a moment before. I'm trying to kind of clarify that when Moses is in Midian and is charged with going back, God tells him, oh, look, I'm going to go. I want you to rescue my people. And here, God says, I want you to rescue my people. The messages are very similar, but there's also a very, very subtle difference. So this is a class on the very, very minute subtlety that tells the whole story, okay? God says here at the beginning of our Parsha, I heard the moaning of the children of Israel, who I'm holding, and who Egypt is holding Israel. Va'eskor, I remember, I call to mind my covenant. Okay? So we've heard something like that at the burning bush, and just for the sake of 10 seconds of entertainment, I will put up the scene for us, because why not? Just let me pause. That clip from the 10 Commandments is always very fascinating and shapes our imagination on things. And, over the course of several summers when I was at camp, often we'd have these plays and God would appear in a character. And the director, who was a good friend of mine, said, look, Elliot, I need you to record the speech here, because your voice is the closest voice that sounds like God. Right, because God is masculine. God in the Torah doesn't speak like this. It doesn't speak with a high feminine voice. God speaks with a deep masculine baritone bass voice, and that's how generations and generations of Jews understand that, and it's God is very gendered in the Bible, and there's not much we can do about that, from a language point. I mean, the current translations, there's a movement among contemporary translators to neuter God, and to the extent that they're effective and are not pushing only the political agenda that's a good subject of debate. The Bible really has no issue with this. It's just what it is. And so when Cecil B. DeMille directed this film, I mean, it wasn't. I don't even think it merited even a second of conversation. It was obvious that they were going to have a deep masculine voice here. Okay, the point though is that God is speaking at the bush, and the content of that speech is different from what's happens elsewhere in the beginning of Parshat VaEra. So the text there says, "Ve'et tza'akatam shamati." God said, "I've seen, yes, seen. Ra'o ra'iti et ani ami. I've seen their affliction. I heard their cry in the face of their slave drivers. Indeed, I have known their suffering." So the movie was pretty accurate to the text. So there's a drama that unfolds between them first hearing the bush and the hearing in our Parsha. A drama that is unfolding in the soul of Moses also, and it directly influences the difference between the two hearings. I'm quoting here, this is my favorite commentator this year, Jonathan Grossman. He has a little short article on this, and he's basically saying like this: something was communicated at the bush, and something is communicated here. In both, we have hearing and seeing and knowing. But there's a difference. In the bush, last week's Parsha and the beginning of our Parsha, we have there's slight difference. Moses escaped because of the manslaughter, because the matter was known, because his brothers confront him. He interacts with the shepherds. He saves Yitro's daughters. He goes to their house. He marries Zipporah. He's a shepherd to Yitro. Here's the bush, and it says in that chapter, "It was many years later, but the king of Egypt died. The children of Israel groaned from the servitude. They cried out, and their plea for help went to God from the servitude. God hearkened to their mourning." Sorry, this is the beginning of our parsha. God hearkened to their mourning. God remembered the covenant. God saw and God knew. 4 verbs: Vayishma, Vayiskor, Vayar, Vayeda. And they heard, remembered, and saw and knew. At the bush, though, it says, Ra'o ra'iti, Shamati, Yadati. There's one verb that's missing at the bush, and that verb is Vayiskor. I'm going to stop there because I see some hands. Go ahead, Ilana.
I have a general question. Why did the children of Israel become slaves? Is there an answer to this? And now God is going to help them and free them from slavery.
So this is a great question, and it goes back to 2 things. One, the first thing, the thing closest in memory is that there is a population of these Hebrews, foreigners in Egypt, and as it says in chapter 1, verse 7 or 8, I think, of chapter 1 of Exodus, where there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and sees this people, this swarming people, and fears that this people will become great and overthrow them. So there is a political dimension to the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt based on the fact that they are now seen as a foreign group. They obviously have some kind of identity. They don't mingle with the rest of the Egyptian population, and Pharaoh feels threatened by them. I often read that, those verses as proto-anti-Semitism. The Pharaoh has such an outsized fear of them. I mean, here, imagine, this is the superpower of the ancient world, and he's afraid of these powerless people. They don't have a military. They don't have any, economic might. They just live in an enclave, and they mind their own business, and that's it. And we read that, with layers and layers of anti-Semitism. That's one. The second answer is that this is part of the covenantal plan that God made with Abraham. That God says to Abraham already at the beginning, in the covenant of the pieces, in chapter 15 of the book of Genesis, your children are going to be enslaved, and so this is fulfilling that part of the plan. But you see, again, everything is meshing together here. That's what's going on here. Nanette and then Susie.
So to me, it seems very political. Here, the Pharaoh, he didn't want to look stupid. He wanted to be the big shot, which, I guess he was. But it just seems very political and like a big power struggle, because he certainly could. If this is the same guy that didn't want the Hebrews, he wanted to get rid of the Jewish male babies, and now all of a sudden he's keeping the Jews. It has to be a power struggle. And then something with all the plagues. He certainly, if he really wanted to get rid of them, he certainly could have said, "Good, go," like the first time. But there's something going on.
Well, of course, there's something going on, and yes, there are a lot of different struggles here. Of course, there's the political struggle of Egypt and the Hebrews, and there's the main political struggle between Pharaoh, the human despot, cruel, sovereign monarch, and the King of Kings, right? God, and that's how the story is going to play itself out. The story is in itself a larger story of who runs the universe. Is the universe run by human power, or is the universe run by divine power? That's really the main theme of Exodus, and probably the main theme of the Bible, which is that there's one God, and God is the sovereign power of the universe. When humans declare to themselves power and absolute power, only evil results, only torture and suffering. But when God has the total power, that's when human beings can really flourish. And that's the unique contribution of the Hebrew imagination to the world, in a nutshell, in a sentence. Okay, Susie, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't remember the details, but I'm very bad on history. But I remember learning once upon a time that Paro had at least one other political enemy. There was some national entity that was that was going to fight him or whatever, wanted to make some incursions, and was afraid that Bnei Israel. In other words, when it says that he's afraid that they're gonna rise up, that this was a legitimate fear that this outsider people might join this other larger entity that he was having trouble with.
Yes, so this is a fear that all totalitarians have. So whoever it was, and were there other groups? Yeah, there were other groups in Egypt as well at the time, and that he may have been afraid of. John, go ahead.
Well, this in regard to Ilana's question. There's a program called Torah.com, which is very interesting. And a rabbi wrote an article suggesting that slavery, as we know it, is not really the accurate word, or may not be the accurate word. He described it as a French word, a corvée, a kind of forced labor, which was common in the region at the time, and said even that the Israelis, the Hebrews, did this to the Canaanites. It's at the time of Joshua. And when we think of slavery, we think of Black slavery in the United States, which is not, the Blacks were property of the slave owners. They had no rights. They had no family life. I think at the time of the Exodus, the Hebrews had their own families. They lived in their own homes. And I think, at least according to this article, the use of the word slavery, he said it might not be the right word to use.
So that may be the case, and of course there are all sorts of shades on a spectrum of what constitutes oppression and slavery. We could go with the lowest common denominator, which is when you are doing something that you have to do because someone else tells you to do it, or else, um, and you do not have freedom to change that, and you're not really getting remunerated for that. That's slavery. I mean, we could all say, maybe at one point or another, when we've worked for bosses, well, it could be like slavery. Well, it's not. If you get a salary and you have the freedom to quit, um, you're not a slave. But there is a spectrum from that kind of slavery. I wouldn't know where to quantify, what the extremes are. Although I would, with relative ease, say that Nazi slavery was probably as bad as it could get, given that you weren't fed and you weren't and you were starved and you were separated from family, you were separated from, and you basically had no rights whatsoever, and the people in control of your lives were you know themselves had total control over your lives. One last comment about the notion of the family. It is a good question as to what happens in the family structures here in Egypt, because you know these scenes are taking place while the male children are being thrown into the Nile, and that is highly disruptive of family life. Of course, it's murder and genocide, um, and crushes the whole family structure. I often point to the fact that when the Israelites, and we'll see this in a couple of weeks, when the first rules relating to the Passover sacrifice and the Passover ritual are enacted, they specifically, clearly, definitively make mention of the fact that these rituals, this meal, is to be eaten as a family. And that's not an accident. It means that part of freedom is the necessity to restructure your civilization in the primary bonds, and the primary bonds are the family. And we got Ilana. Go ahead. Go ahead, Ilana.
But somebody was
Oh,
before me.
Eva, did Eva have your hand up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I
I'm
had
sorry.
my hand up because it had to do with the question of why did Pharaoh was afraid of the Hebrews. I read that the Pharaoh in the time of Joseph was a Hittite Pharaoh, because Egypt was like 400 years, I don't know how many hundred of years, under a Hittite rule, and the Hittites were a Semitic people. And eventually the Egyptians rose up against them and drove them out. And therefore it's understandable if they were afraid of Jews that were privileged under, the Hebrews were privileged under the previous regime, and they were left over from the previous regime.
Yeah, look, a lot of the, we're always trying to connect the Bible with what we find in history and archaeology, and that's a fascinating subject of inquiry. Our friend Gary Rensburg is involved in that quite a bit. Go ahead, Alana.
I don't want to sound naive, but the $1 million question, why, like in previous history and through many generations, why do bad things happen to the Jewish people, including these terrible days today? And I know there is not exactly an answer, but where is God? I hate to ask it, but it really bothers me.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to read the text without that question. And the text, therefore, and religious understanding is really, it makes for the confrontation with that reality, which is a human reality is a reality that exists with tremendous joys and also tremendous anguish. And our Jewish reality all the more so, which is to say that it's a deeply human experience to live as a Jew, which is to live with the great, joys and sense of connectedness and a terror of the sense of abandonment. Not only that, but to live with a sense of, a whole civilization and culture and set of values, and to also confront a world that wants to destroy us. And we could make the argument that the two are connected, that it's precisely because we have and we possess this treasure, that the world wants to commit Judeicide, the end of the Jews. This Our existence is deeply threatening to the world, because it challenges the world, and it forces the world to have two possibilities of reaction to us. One is, boy, we admire them for their relationship with their past and their relationship, of course, with their God and with their traditions and their laws and their rules, etc. Or we despise them for that, or we envy them for that. And those civilizations that have admired Jews and learned from Jews and learned with Jews tend to do much better. Those that don't do not. And that is a truism within the Bible's understanding of life and of our people, which is, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And that accompanies Judaism and Jewish people and Israel forever. And we live in that quandary, and it involves tremendous, tremendous challenge and suffering, but also tremendous possibility. We happen to be living in this moment of tremendous anguish and torment and suffering for our people and for Israel in particular, and for the hundreds of families that are affected by both October 7th and the aftermath in the war. And we of course, have close orbits to all of that within our community. And it's excruciating. But the alternative is what? There is no alternative. And we go on. We go on despite this. And faith demands of us to at least acknowledge the difficulties of unanswerable questions, such as the one that you raised. It's an unanswerable question. Why? Life, to be a human being, is to live with unanswerable questions, and to be a Jew is to live with these deeply, deeply unanswerable questions. Gittel and then Steve.
Yeah, so you really just kind of put it together a bit, but with the uptick in anti-Semitism, there have been a lot of articles about why the anti-Semitism, why has it happened? And I have read more than one opinion that says, and you did touch on this now, that the Jews brought a conscience to the world, and they still resent us for having brought that sense of a conscience.
Yeah. Look, there's so many valences to anti-Semitism, and that certainly is one of them. And today, anti-Semitism manifesting itself as anti-Zionism, I think it's just another variation of that. Anti-Zionism has at its core a deep resentment that here an oppressed people can actually, pull itself up and create something quite amazing, and take itself out of the oppressed state. And of course, when the accusation of its oppression is leveled against it, it fulfills a remarkable paradigm for people who hate us. Steve, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I am muted. Okay. First, I want to say that Abe, the right idea. I've read that some scholars think it was the Hyksos, not necessarily Hittites, but Semitic peoples who ruled Egypt, and Egypt and conquered them. And the idea is that the Jews were left after they conquered them, and that's why they went into slavery. But now I have another question. Why didn't Pharaoh just kill Moses? You know, these guys had a lot of power. Why did he let him run?
Right, and I guess we can make all sorts of speculations about that. We could argue the same things. Why don't they? Why doesn't America assassinate Vladimir Putin? Why don't you assassinate your enemy, your aggressor,
Well, that's hard.
well, it's hard. So not that it would have been hard, but my only speculative answer is that Pharaoh has to be Pharaoh, and Pharaoh has to retain a certain set of credibility. And the tension that Pharaoh has is, how do I remain as a power without kind of alienating the people that are next to me? I have to at least feign a certain moral presence too, But we could go on and speculate about that, and of course there wouldn't be much of a story. So, all right, who's next? Susie, and then John, and Bob.
So, in answer to Steve, it just occurred to me, Paro maybe didn't take Moshe seriously.
That's
So
also true. That's also
so
true.
why should he, kill him? Because it's like, like, who are you to? It's like, but what I was going to say, I have a friend who has a friend who hangs out with a Jewish woman who coffee clutches with a whole lot of non-Jewish women. And she once asked them, she's like, why do people hate us? And their answer was that they're jealous.
So, jealousy is certainly part of it. Okay. And jealousy does stimulate hatred. Who is first, John or Bob? We'll flip and go.
Bob, you go.
Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the more interesting interpretations that I recently read was that one of the burdens that Hashem was lifting during the slavery was the burden of acquiescence that the Jews had at that time in accepting the slavery that was there. And it reminds me of some things that some African American therapy colleagues of mine have mentioned about PTSD also being interpreted as post-traumatic slavery disorder. And that the whole idea of the 10 plagues, along with sort of the issues of hardening of Pharaoh's heart, was also to soften the hearts of the Hebrews and to make them ready to be able to escape from what's going on. So it's not just the external enslavement, but it's the internalized, if you will, enslavement and oppression, which I thought was really interesting and lovely.
It's a valuable point that is to say the slavery is also it's not a physical condition, it's a spiritual condition. John, go ahead.
Oh, this is an answer to Steve's question, and I think you answered it. Why didn't Pharaoh kill Moses right away? Then you'd lose the story.
Yeah.
The whole story, the whole point of the story
What point of view?
is a battle between two gods.
Of course.
That's the whole key to it. So if Pharaoh kills Moses, what's the point of the whole story?
Indeed. Okay, good literary answers. Skip, and then we're going to go on.
I just want to relate back to what Bob said before about, are we American Jews or Jewish Americans? And if you look back on the African American approach or the Native American approach, they're looking up and they're standing up and are very proud of their being. And I think it's time, and excuse me, Rabbi, you may disagree with me, and I don't care. It's time that Jewish Americans stand up and say, I am a Jew, but I'm also an American. Now, I can say that because I'm a Jew and I felt in the military.
Right.
And it's time for Jews in the United States to stand up. We are not second-class citizens.
Right.
We're American.
You're American. No, and I would amplify what you said and just put it in this context, which is, again, this what I said was that we, as living in the United States and living in this period of modernity, are now used to many layers of identity that you know that they're not competing with each other. They are at the very best. They complement each other. I mean, nobody, among us certainly would see any conflict with our American, identities or Jewish identities, and in a way the beauty and the kind of blessing of living in this country is the ability to have this symbiotic relationship. Look, there was interesting, and just to kind of end this point, which is at the rally, 2 months ago when the war started, or a month ago, 2 months ago, there was a young woman, student at Columbia, who got up and spoke. So she was African American, Jewish, and first and Native. She has Indian ancestry or Native American ancestry. So and a woman. So here you had, and she was deliberately chosen, and she's tremendously articulate and all that. Got up because she said, "I am a Jew, right? I have skin color. I am a Native American. I am American, and I am a Jew." And God, I said, these are the multiple identities that are converging in me, and that's part of the Jewish story.
But Rabbi, I don't see that happening in the Jewish world.
Oh, it's happening much more than you think.
Wait a minute, where the
Yeah.
Jews are standing up and saying, "I am a Jew, but I'm also I salute the flag. I uphold the Constitution, but I am a Jew." And I don't see that in the Jewish community.
Okay, so we'll leave the debate there. Let me wrap this up with our the text that I want to show here. So I'm hurtling towards a point here. The point that I'm making in terms of what is it that is the driver for Moses's his Midianite experience, and when Moses comes out of Midian and now is in front of Pharaoh. When you compare these texts, and I realize that it's a very subtle textual analysis, the one thing that is present in this parsha that was not present in the previous parsha is where God says, I remember the covenant, okay? When God speaks to Moses at the bush, he doesn't say, I remember what I said to Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. But when God speaks to Moses here, he says, I remember my covenant. I remember what I promised. So what I want to say here is as follows. There are two aspects to God's rescue of the people of Israel in Egypt. I'll stop sharing for a second, and I'll put it without the text. There's oppression, and there's suffering, the experience of servitude, humiliation, all of that, which is a moral component to salvation, right? You see someone in distress, you have a moral imperative to save that person. As a person who learned life-saving skills, right? When as a counselor at camp, I learned the motto of the Royal Canadian Life-Saving Society, which says, whomsoever you see in distress, recognize him as your fellow man. That was masculine. They changed it to, neutral gender. Whosoever you see in distress, recognize as your fellow human being. That's the primary imperative of anyone who's involved in rescue work or first aid society. You don't, when you are a first aid responder, you're not going to respond out of any kind of imperative other than the moral imperative. Here's a person who's bleeding. You're bleeding. I'm rescuing you. I'm sorry. So there's the moral component to God's interaction here, which is the component that he communicates to Moses at the bush. And he's saying to Moses, my people are suffering. I want you to go rescue them. Okay? And he's appealing to that in Moses because Moses is a moral person, moral in the sense he's already had 3 moral experiences. He's saved the Hebrew life. He's tried to intervene when 2 Hebrews were fighting, and he's intervened with the women at the well. He's a deeply moral human being. So God is appealing to Moses on moral grounds. You can relate to this, Moses. They're suffering. I want you to rescue suffering people, period. But then he goes to Egypt, and then he gets the stuffing knocked out of him by his fellow Jews. And I'm saying it here. He says, he goes in front of Pharaoh, and his attempt to rescue is rewarded with more harshness. And his fellow Israelites see this as a problem, and they condemn him. So for all the good that Moses tries to do, he's rewarded with their enmity. And the question then is, how are you going to identify now? Are you going to go run back to Midian? Or are you going to stay with this? And so what God appeals to here at the beginning of the Parsha is I'm including you in this sense of peoplehood now. What I've said to you before appealed to your moral character. What I'm saying to you now is appealing to your historical character. These are not in conflict. They are now fused together. Now you are leading not only out of a moral imperative to save the people from their oppression, you're leading them as a historical imperative to fulfill my covenant. God is the moral God who wants to save the people from oppression, but God is the historical God who wants to fulfill the covenant with the people. And that's the meaning of this moment. The meaning of this moment is the fusion of the moral with the historical. That's what's going on here. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I'd also offer that maybe Moses had a 4th moral experience because Batya heard his cry and also rescued him. And one wonders what the women in his life raising him must have said or talked about with him to create the sense of caring and seeking justice and things like that. So I'm wondering if there's been any comments comparing God's hearing the cries of the Hebrew to Batya hearing the cry of Moses.
So Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, who's not named Batya, but is the daughter of Pharaoh. The tradition names her. So she is an exemplar of this of a moral human being, right? And it's so interesting. She is not part of any covenant. She's not, but there's an affirmation that the humanity is being manifest in people who are not bound to God in any kind of particularistic way. And that's the greatness of this individual, the daughter of Pharaoh, right? The moral nature of, there weren't too many of them within Egypt. There were, but she certainly is one of them. John, go ahead. I'm going to stop that and say, go ahead, John.
I just wonder the extent to which these Hebrew slaves associate themselves with the covenant. Maybe by this time, having lived in Egypt so long, they've forgotten. And I don't know if the text makes clear the answer to that question.
So the text leaves that issue off the table and kind of engages us into this speculation as to what do they know. The tradition answers that question and says, with it lauds the people by saying, Lo shinu et lashonam, lo shinu et shemam. They did not change their language and they did not change their names. So they maintained traditions. They maintained, some semblance of identity. But let's take some of the defining features of pre Sinai Hebrewhood, Israelitehood, like circumcision. Well, was circumcision performed then? Well, you could argue that it was, okay, that they did, or you could argue that it wasn't. You could argue that it was, given that there's no mention of it, elsewhere, and that there's an assumption, and that in fact the argument that they did is found in the fact that Moses, when he was in Midian and fathered two sons, did not circumcise his sons, precisely as a way of avoiding that part of his identity. And that the only way he could go back to Egypt to save the Israelites was by circumcising his son in a very, very mysterious, and it's a very difficult passage. It's a couple of verses in last week's Parasha where on the way back, God threatens to kill Moses, and Zipporah, his wife, the Midianite, is the one who circumcises Moses' son and puts the blood on Moses as a kind of protection. And so all of this, these leads to so many different kinds of interpretation. But there's one little fact here, which is that Moses didn't circumcise his son. And that is an identity question as well. And then of course, the generation of the Exodus, those born in the desert, once they get into the land of Israel with Joshua, in order to observe Passover, the first Passover in the land, Joshua circumcises all of the adult males, which only makes you question and says, well, why weren't they circumcised in the desert? They evidently weren't. And so what Joshua does is he circumcises all the males at Givat HaAralot, right? The hill of the foreskins, where everybody...
Not before a battle, though.
Exactly. So and that of course is part of it, that in order, the covenant and Passover, these are all deeply connected. Well, I wanted to what I wanted to do with the text is show that as the drama now unfolds, you have Moses' identity intact, that you have the moral part of his character fused with the particularist Hebraic covenantal part of his character, and that he, having traversed the boundary from Midian to Egypt, is also traversing the boundary of his past quasi-identities to his full identity as the leader. And he must be able to embrace both the moral and the covenantal together in order to lead the people. And that, I think, is the essence of the preamble in our Parsha this week, which calls, by its difference to the previous episode of the bush, the memory of the covenant, which is particular to the experience which now Moses has. And so that I think is a very important layer of understanding. That's I got from, once again, from Jonathan Grossman in a small article that he wrote on this. And that is that. Boy, got a long way. Here we go again, starting again. I'll just stop.